Gee whiz! Hello and welcome back to this Downful Idealistic Crusade. This video is a review of Ignite Films' absolutely breathtaking and astonishing release on 4K UHD of the 1953 science fiction classic Invaders from Mars, directed by the legendary visionary William Cameron Menzies, and is without question one of the most important and one of the most legendary 50s science fiction films, and the film that has to this day and continues to scare and terrify generations of children who never forget it. If you see it young, it sears itself upon your memory immediately, however you see it. But it's been a very difficult film to see properly for a very long time. It's had a very troubled release history and has been withdrawn many times and re-edited many times. And of course, the foreign versions did have additional footage inserted and a completely different ending, particularly for the British release. So it's not a easy film to pin down, which isn't helped by the fact that it was shot on a low budget in a particular color process, which was very convoluted and is also very hard to restore and rectify on modern releases. So the only video releases it has had over the years have been pretty abominable. And then it was also, unfortunately, one of the most famous of a number of films that were sort of picked up, or there was a sort of debate on if this person really had the rights, but the collector Wade Williams claimed ownership of the film for many years and had his own personal vault elements locked away, and then would allow them to get used very rarely for video releases, which we had the old 80s VHS release, then the attempt at a cleanup on the Laserdisc release, which is really just to see how this film was presented back in the day, and in an attempt at a restoration is pretty dire. And then that sort of gets spiffed up a little in, I think it was 2002 for the Image DVD release, and then that's been it for the film, and that DVD went out of print pretty quickly. So it has been an expensive and difficult thing to even get the older, very crappy, terrible versions of the film that were the best you could do, unfortunately. And that was it, because again, the person who had claimed to have the rights and everything sort of kept the film locked away with a lot of other 50 science fiction classics and a lot of other films, which is one of the unfortunate parts of film preservation that you sometimes run into. So this is a film that has been a real dream title, honestly a holy grail for a lot of 50 science fiction fans and people who grew up with this film and always wanted it to look and sound at its absolute best. It never has since the original release, and of course there were many different edits of the film depending on where you saw it. So I'd say probably after the, maybe first week or two of its run, it started to get degraded, and then it got pulled, and then when it showed up as a reissue, who knows what version it would be or how it would look. And sometimes people saw it in black and white, which the film still works, of course, but and it doesn't lose any of its impact because it is that impactful, particularly on young audiences to this day. But this is the first time I think you can safely say that the film is as best presented as it possibly can be. This was a nightmare of a restoration. This was supervised by Scott MacQueen, who actually came out of retirement because it was Invaders from Mars. It's that big of a thing, and this has been a film that preservationists and archivists and many people have wanted to do this work and tried to do this work for actually a good number of decades. This isn't a new thing. This isn't we can do this now. No, this is literally, I wondered how the heck they had done it and gotten around Wade Williams, who actually passed away this past year, apparently. So I don't know if maybe there was finally some relenting on that, or maybe because Ignite Films is based in Europe, there was some way they were able to work around it. I don't know how it happened, but I just can't believe it actually did. So that adds to the, oh my God, I can't believe this is real. I still keep wondering. I keep expecting to wake up like little David and all of a sudden find that it is not what I thought it was. And I keep expecting to wake up and find this is a dream. That's how important of a release this is. Ignite Films is a small company. This is their first release, and there was a bit of trouble with people trying to get their copies, and they did have to move back the release and shipping dates a couple times, which, you know, it is understandable, and we were still coming out of the pandemic and stuff, and I know some people were a bit got a little bit upset about that, but with this being their first release, and they're based in Europe, and Arrow Video helped them with the disc manufacturing. So when you get to the menus, they look just like an Arrow menu of an Arrow Blu-ray or UHD. So it's not an Arrow disc. They just helped Ignite actually manufacture and actually put the disc together. So it's got the Arrow menu. Thankfully, all those issues have been worked out, and so you just order directly from Ignite, and it's pretty easy. Of course, since it is a small company and this is their first release and they're based in Europe, the price tag is quite a bit higher than your usual standard, especially than your standard big studio release. It's a little bit more pricey than your standard boutique release, but again, keep in mind this is their first release, and there was a very exhaustive and intensive, nightmarish restoration effort to be able to put this together. And so this is such an important film that I do think it does warrant the higher purchase price, but I can understand people kind of being on the fence or kind of waiting for, saving up a little bit, because if you go for the Blu-ray, it's $50 plus shipping, and then the UHD is $60 plus shipping. And again, that is a little bit on the pricey side, which I understand. And I myself was kind of wondering until more information came out. I'm like, well, is this really going to be that good? Basically, when I saw Scott MacQueen's name being involved, that's when I knew. I'm like, okay, yes, you have my money, no problem. He is, of course, one of the great names in the history of film preservation and film archiving, and if you see his name anywhere involved in something, you're like, okay, yes, I know this has been done with the extreme due diligence. So once I saw he was involved and he'd actually come out of retirement to supervise this, I'm like, okay, yes, that's all I needed to know. So again, this isn't a release you can just go purchase at most major retailers. I think some stores are stocking it on their websites. I think Orbit DVD or maybe Diabolique, or some of the independent sellers and various U.S. websites are stocking copies of this. But if you can't find it there, just go directly to Ignite Films, and I'll have the link in the description below. They did have a limited edition at first, which sold out pretty quick, which was basically the release plus an autographed poster by Jimmy Hunt, the star of the film, who very graciously signed a bunch of posters, but those sold out pretty quick. But again, the only real difference is you got the autographed poster as well as the disc contents. So the disc contents are the same. That's why I thought it was important to start with just a little bit of background about this release and why it's so important and why it's a little bit more pricey and why you can't just go get it in every store or buy it on Amazon or wherever you usually buy physical media releases. This is one of those really special cases where you really do need to go and support this company and their work. Again, this is their first release. They have said they are working on other titles. Those haven't been revealed yet, but I would assume that they'd follow the same sort of release pattern. You buy directly from them. There'll be a separate Blu-ray and a UHD, and I think they're going to do some more 50 science fiction titles, but again, that's just a guess. They haven't really said, but they are working on others, and this is labeled as Spine Number 1, so apparently they're looking forward into the future already quite a bit. But this is a really special case where, yes, it's a bit pricey. Yes, you do have to special order it. Yes, it's not a dual format release, but this is one of those type. I never thought this would happen. Never. It was a pipe dream type scenario where it's like, oh, what if Invaders from Mars got restored? It's like, well, there's no way Wade Williams is going to let that happen, unfortunately, and people have tried, so it's just kind of one of those, well, I guess I'm stuck with the old Laserdisc master, which is horrible. So again, I keep expecting to wake up and find this has been a dream. It's that level of, I can't believe this exists and this has been done, and you can actually purchase a copy of this. So that is why this is so incredibly important. Now, to talk about the film itself and why it's so important and why it's such an iconic landmark 50s science fiction film, it really kind of shoots the odds a bit, because you're not going to get away from the fact that this is a low budget film, not made for one of the major studios. It's made and shot in the Cinecolor process, which was, when you read up on how it actually produced a color image, was a very convoluted way of getting a color image, but of course much cheaper than actually using real Technicolor. So it's different in a certain way, and it's also meaning that this film will never overcome those low budget origins, and that has led to many people pointing out all the little bits of fun, and the most obvious being the zippers on the back of the costumes of the Martians, which, you know, once you see them as an adult, they kind of make the film even more endearing in a sort of way. But even things like that don't wreck the experience, because what makes the film so incredibly special and so arresting, and the thing that really haunts you, is the fact that the entire film is designed and played out in a dreamlike, very eerie sensibility, because the whole film actually is not just centered around a child, the lead character of David, played by Jimmy Hunt. It is actually told from his perspective. The film is designed to mimic and give the audience the perception of how a young boy will see the world, how every single adult sort of almost towers over them, whether they're a good, benevolent figure, which we see at first as the film opens, and then the opposite when they are extremely negative and domineering and frightening figures, even figures of authority. This even goes into the design of the individual shots, the design of the sets. Probably the most famous ones are, of course, when David goes to the police station and it looks like it's something out of a minimal German expressionist nightmare, with distorted angles and the actual set looking like it's about to devour young David as he runs in terror. And, of course, the iconic set of David's backyard with the fence through the trees, where he views the people going out to look at the site, where he, at the beginning of the film at night, sees what seems to be a Martian spacecraft land off in the distance behind a hill. And even the individual shots, because of the design of them and the way that the photography is designed to work with the stylization of the set, you could look at any image from this film and it's unsettling, even if you're looking at still frames. And this even extends to the close-ups, because what David realizes is going on is that everyone who goes to check out the Martian site disappears for a while, and then when they reappear, they're not themselves, and they have essentially been taken by the alien forces and made to do their bidding, and are no longer themselves, which is a horrifying thought for a child, particularly when the first people this happens to are David's parents, who start out very loving and warm and affectionate in the opening of the film, and then immediately do a 180. And seeing this as a child is absolutely terrifying. It's still unsettling as an adult, and this is only heightened by the fact that the whole film has this dreamlike eeriness that is in every single frame and facet. The MVP of this film that you will never get away from, the person that you have to talk about the entire time, is its director, William Cameron Menzies, who is really the person who came up with the term production designer, because he really was Hollywood's premier production designer and one of the greatest visual stylists in the entire cinematic medium's history. You cannot talk about motion picture design or the art of production design without talking about William Cameron Menzies. His visual concepts were revolutionary. His notable credits, of course, include Gone with the Wind and The Thief of Baghdad. He goes all the way back to the silent days. And he even turned his hand to directing a few times. And while he himself would probably be the first to admit that directing actors was not necessarily his strong suit, every film he ever directed has an incredible sense of visual presence. The visuals really do lead everything. And to be honest, Invaders from Mars is the one place where I think that's incredible, overpowering visual strength and sense of design really meshes firmly with a more grounded human emotional story, particularly because it's all from a child's perspective. So it seems to have been Menzies' idea from the get-go that this story, which is admittedly rather simple, and when it started, it was even more simple, as it seems. His idea to really make something out of it was to not tell it straight, was to not just make it yet another admittedly low budget 50s science fiction film that was coming out when this was really becoming a new sort of bread and butter type of release for not the major studios yet, but a lot of the more minor and independent studios, and they would start cranking them out because it was, of course, the atomic age, and this was part of popular culture, and this had started to really take off. So it's Menzies who makes Invaders from Mars really stand out from the pack and overcome its low budget origins. And in a lot of ways, the low budget origins actually sort of enhance a lot of his stylings, and that adds to the sense of eeriness because, it's shot in a studio. It's not using real locations. So there is a little bit of playing around with the artificiality of the scenario. And this really dovetails perfectly with the exaggerated sets, and it really is like laying bare the inner workings of child psychology. So you really do completely emphasize with David throughout the film, whether you're seeing it for the first time as an adult, or if you've seen it many times, or if it still haunts you because you saw it as a young child. The film also has one of the greatest endings in all of film history, and one of the supremely disturbing endings, which I will not spoil for anyone. Unfortunately, this was sort of wrecked when it was rejected in the UK and other territories as being not good. So that's part of what led to the alternate foreign versions, which they do go over in the extras. And there was some additional material shot rather amusingly that looks nothing like the rest of the film. And the actors are all older, particularly Jimmy Hunt, who was, a young boy. So a year or so later, he looks totally different. And it's just shoved in the film in a couple spots to pad out the runtime. And then they also changed the ending, which doesn't work. So if you ever saw this film in the UK version or some of the many different cuts that float around over the years, you might have been confused a little bit and kind of wondering why this had such a great reputation when you got to those bits specifically. But they don't wreck the film, but it's wonderful that we finally don't have to worry about those versions anymore. But thankfully, all that footage has been newly scanned and included in the supplemental features where it absolutely should be. But this is a film you need to see in its original version, which is here in the restoration. The other notable thing in terms of something that distracts the viewer and makes you just kind of start scratching your head is there is a certain portion of the film, particularly a certain percentage of the film, I should say, where apparently it was the producer who thought that he needed to pad the runtime out a little bit. And so you suddenly get a bunch of footage in a couple different spots of army maneuvers and moving tanks around and troops moving around and things. And you're starting to wonder, well, why is all this here? And it becomes very quickly apparent that this is actually just stock footage. It's just been shoved into the film. And they also use a little bit in the climax. And that part's understandable because, obviously this is a low budget film. They didn't have, army cooperation to move some tanks around. Plus they were on a set. So, the little bits of stock footage mixed in and edited into the climax makes sense. But it's repeated a number of times, and it starts about halfway through the film. There's suddenly a couple minute chunk of some tanks and troops moving around. It's just like, okay, that for me is what always throws me. I don't mind anything else, but it's just like that's the part that just kind of sticks out a little bit because it is literally just stock footage just shoved in there. But it's sort of amusing in another way, and it helps endear the film even more to you. This is one of those films that the more you learn about its production, the hurdles and hardships that they had to work through, and just how little money they had, and how short sort of a shooting schedule it had, it just makes it all the more impressive. But again, you come back to the same factor over and over and over again of William Cameron Menzies, who is really the person who made something unique out of this. This is a unique film. It is so unique and so impactful on all those who ever saw it that it has been copied, lifted from, borrowed from many, many times over. And when you see it, you'll start to recognize some things that you've probably seen done a million different ways. And also, of course, it was unfortunately remade in the 80s in a rather forgettable, not good remake, which I would advise just don't really bother with. But it also, in a certain way, it fits in with other 50 science fiction films of this time period. And I'd say probably what it might link to most in terms of what you could probably feel a little echo of is It Came from Outer Space, where you have the people of the town suddenly showing up and acting strange, but instead of being essentially possessed by the alien entities as they are in Invaders from Mars, we find that in It Came from Outer Space, they are merely copies that are doing the bidding of the outside forces instead of actually taking control of these people. But there's a little bit of question there, and I just thought there's maybe a little echo of Bradbury's It Came from Outer Space, a story idea that you can recognize in Invaders from Mars. And you'll see this in all the classic 50s science fiction films, that they sort of echo other films. And of course, this is all stemming from the explosion of science fiction and in terms of actual print materials, and particularly for pulp and adventure magazines that became science fiction pulp magazines, and then of course the explosion of science fiction literature and short stories. So this all was sort of stemming from the same sources, but I just think it's interesting to look at some of the echoes to other famous science fiction works. But there is no other film quite like Invaders from Mars. It is still one of the best films about childhood from the child's perspective. It has a certain dreamlike eeriness. Some people have even compared it to The Night of the Hunter, which I think is a very apt comparison. If you know that film, it's one of the great films directed by Charles Laughton, where the children, especially when they are fleeing from the villainous preacher character played by Robert Mitchum, it frequently takes on a dreamlike, eerie quality, and it's sort of distorted in ways from actual reality, because it is trying to give a sense of the children's perspective and how the world seems larger than life, and it preys upon their fears, essentially. So I think that is a very apt comparison. So if you love Night of the Hunter, which you should, you will recognize a lot of the same things in Invaders from Mars and also have a great time. I think that's probably the closest comparison you could make to something that has that same sort of focus on an eerie, dreamlike, and sometimes frightening atmosphere, focusing around children and trying to give an idea of child psychology. That, of course, means that, again, nothing in the film is played straight, exactly as it would be in a standard film. Some people might look at this, seeing it for the first time, and think, "Oh, well, why are all the actors? Why do they sound kind of maybe a little stilted in places?" Well, that's done for effect, and that is exactly the same thing as the effect of designing the sets in a certain way to make them very, very, very strange and odd feeling. That again, there's no image in this film that isn't slightly unsettling in a way. So everything seems slightly off. Nothing is fully realistic, except for maybe one or two of the shots where they have some location footage and there's some people actually walking around outside in a practical location, which there isn't a lot of that, but the few times you see that, it's like, oh wow, are we in the real world for a second? Because we're so used to the intensive stylization of the rest of the film. This even goes into the editing, particularly when you get towards the ending. In the climax, there are some shots that are actually repeated, and they're done in a way, and there's an editing rhythm established that is furthering this dreamlike atmosphere. So while some people may still look at this as like, oh, they're just repeating these shots over and over, isn't that kind of dumb? it's done for an effect. It's cut in a way to heighten this effect. Whether this was because they ran out of money or they didn't have all the shots they needed, I'm not exactly sure. But it was placed and edited in a way to make it actually fit the rest of the film. And so when you get to the spaceship and you get to the suits with the zippers on the back, and it's obviously very low budget, this is only stuff you see in hindsight, because the entire atmosphere of the film has generated to a point that none of that matters. And when you do spot some things, or where some things look a little weird, it's fitting in this dreamlike, eerie atmosphere. So it fits, and it feels otherworldly and odd and exotic and strange and a little bit unsettling. So again, this is one of those films that when you see it, especially as a kid, it really sticks with you and it really messes you up, and it has plenty of nightmare fuel. So this is one of the original nightmare fuel films, I think, and that's why so many people remember it fondly and why it's been so influential, and so many people have been inspired by this film and terrified by this film. And you mention this to anyone of a certain age and they will know exactly what you're talking about. They know Invaders from Mars. Even if they never saw it again, it's still burned into their consciousness that deeply. This film was, again, photographed in a process known as Cinecolor, which, when properly shown, it's not the sort of rich, vibrant hues of Technicolor. It has a unique look to it. But what Menzies does with this, and in collaboration with his cameraman, who was actually John F. Seitz, one of the legendary cinematographers, particularly known for his work during the film noir period. I mean, this Seitz was the man who shot Double Indemnity, and he's shooting Invaders from Mars. This creates a sort of synergy between the two, because the photography of this film, it has a really striking, it really accentuates every single one of Menzies' designs, and particularly the sets, and also the color has a particular vivid quality that I don't think you might necessarily always associate with Cinecolor and the other processes that tried to compete with Technicolor and do so much more cheaply. And that's what really comes across in this restoration that's only, I think, kind of been hinted at before in the really crummy versions that preceded it. So this is a film that's really notable even for its color photography that, again, you wouldn't expect from a lower budgeted film. And I think this had to be something that Menzies thought about, even though apparently he really designed the film more in mind with just black and white. But honestly, that principle actually makes sense for the color, because a lot of the really great cinematographers started out in black and white, and they still thought in black and white terms. For example, I think one of the reasons why Jack Asher is one of the greatest cinematographers who ever lived, who was Hammer's first major cinematographer of their horror films, and really revolutionized color and the horror genre, and those are some of the best color films ever shot. He shot everything he did still designing and lighting as if he was shooting a black and white film, and thus adding color on top of that, because black and white is much more intricate to shoot for and to light for, and much harder than shooting a color film, actually. You have to be much more intricate. You have to think about every bit of nuance, and particularly worry about the grayscale between the light and dark areas. When you're using that mentality, but actually shooting in color, the color actually sort of fills in where you're thinking about black and white, and the intricacies you're lighting for as a cameraman, that gets replicated in the actual color nuances. So even if it's a simpler process that's a bit weird in how it works, and it's a cheaper process like Cinecolor compared to Technicolor, this means that your color photography is going to be much more intricate and much more vivid and nuanced than if you were just doing what most people do, which is just light the set, and it's in color, and you make sure everything is properly lit to be visible. I think that's a real distinction when you have cameramen who started working in color, who had worked their whole careers in black and white and had that experience. Whether they thought about this consciously or not is, as I don't know, but ever since I found that there was an interview, or there's a quote of Jack Asher talking about how he always shot his color films but lit them as if he was still working in black and white. So I think there was definitely a degree of that here. And again, you have one of the great cameramen in John Seitz shooting this film and these beautifully designed sets. Another amazing thing, this film had a very short schedule. It had a very low budget, of course, but Menzies was so ahead of everyone in terms of how to design a production and how to run things that the entire film was pretty much shot in one soundstage at Republic Studios, and it was a giant soundstage, but this meant that each of the sets were basically in one spot of the stage. So if you turn the corner, like in one corner would be the police station, and another corner would be the interior of David's house, and then on one side would be the large backyard with the fence and all the trees that's so immediately iconic to anyone who's seen the film, and then some sets would be redressed, but so well that you won't notice they're the same set unless you go and step frame through them, or you study the film meticulously. And this is also differentiated with lighting and gels and of course composition. And to think that Menzies was able to pull all of this off, and basically just imagining like the entire film within one large sound stage, and everywhere you turn is another set, and it's already there and ready to go, and it's all there in one sound stage, is just astounding. So that's another way that, of course, they were able to shoot the film so quickly. And so I think that's another example of Menzies just being an incredible genius who was never properly respected as fully as he should have been, because he really was ahead of his time in every aspect. Another example of this, Menzies, of course, Invaders from Mars, directed one of the great, iconic, important, landmark science fiction films. But he had also done that before, in the 1930s, because you do have to look at his work on H.G. Wells's Things to Come, which was made in the UK for Alexander Korda. It's a very odd film. It's extraordinarily preachy, because Wells was given essentially authorship and fought to get all of his philosophy into the film. So it's a film that's always sort of fighting itself. But one thing that you can't argue is that its vision of the future, and various futures, I should say, because it spans an enormous time period, in spite of the inherent preachy quality, and in spite of Menzies admitting he was not a very good actor's director, it is a beyond striking visual experience. It's one of those films that everybody should see at least once. It has been hugely influential and was really quite probably the most important science fiction film made after Metropolis, the Fritz Lang silent epic. So in that interim, you have to basically wait until Things to Come, until someone did a large budget, large scale science fiction film that really went for broke and tried to do something. And that film also was released in a variety of edits, and the best we have now is a reconstruction of the closest to the original release version that is known to exist. It's again a very preachy film. It's a hard watch for a lot of people, but it is one of those films that I think even if you're not a fan of it, you can still watch it and just marvel at the visuals and what Menzies is doing. He didn't have full design control on that film, but of course you can feel his presence throughout, and it is an incredible science fiction experience, particularly for being made in the 1930s in Great Britain. You see that film and you would think that it had been made in Hollywood, but it was not. So I highly recommend people check that out if they want to know more of Menzies' directing work, and particularly in the science fiction realm, because Things to Come, while it it has issues, it is still one of the truly important landmark science fiction films that deserves to be studied intensively, and particularly for the time period. And again, you can tell when you see it, and you recognize the same there's the same sort of entity in there that you have as the driving force behind Invaders from Mars. So Menzies was no stranger, essentially, to the science fiction genre. So now let's turn to the actual release itself. This is, again, Ignite Films' first release, and they released it both on a standard Blu-ray and then a UHD. They are both sold separately, so unfortunately it's not a dual format release, and the UHD is about $10 more. This is one of those titles where, because the restoration was so intensive and the elements they had were degraded to varying degrees, there's only so much that can be done with them. So this is not where you should go in expecting a pristine picture and soundtrack, and then be upset when you see some scratches and hairs and various bits that are inescapable. That is simply going to be there because this is really the best that is humanly possible, and it was a Herculean task to even get to this point. So this might be a case where, if you're not big on seeing damage and inherent issues sort of laid bare or be very obvious, the Blu-ray standard dynamic range version will maybe mask a little bit, maybe hide a little bit of that. It's still going to be visible, of course, but it won't be as as obvious as what you have in the 4K HDR version, which because of the higher resolution and the better technical specifications and the HDR grading, the inherent damage and in terms of the elements is going to be more obvious than what you would see in the 1080p SDR version. Outside of that fact, this is an example where you should just go for the 4K UHD, because this is really done as best as humanly possible. They had to work from 5 different elements. If you're looking at the restoration information that is provided, and Scott MacQueen did a whole write-up for the booklet, which I'll get to in a minute. So they had to work together and patch together 5 different elements. Thankfully, they did have the original negative to work from, but they couldn't use it for everything, and it was damaged and degraded and had many issues. So they had to mix and match the original negative. They had to mix and match even some foreign prints they turned up, and they also had to use all these elements for the soundtrack restoration. So this is a patchwork. This is not a pristine negative scan, and they were able to go in and clean up every last bit and make it look all nice and fancy and new. This will have some baked-in issues. So when you're watching this transfer, you are going to see the occasional bit of speckles pop up, very minute, but they happen occasionally. There is a line or two, nothing terrible or major, and you can tell they have tried to minimize that as much as possible, but you are going to see that once or twice. There's a little tiny bit of frame movement here and there, which is natural and nothing crazy. There is an occasional hair or two that they couldn't escape, and they were stuck having to use. And there are some bits where they did have to use those other sources. So there are a few places where you will see the quality shift a little bit. There is going to be a little bit of quality drop in a spot or two. And it's basically as if you had to go to a short dupe section for a particular bit of material, where it's obviously not the original negative, but it's from another generation away. Those are minor, and they are done as best as possible to where you don't have it, be like a big jump and you're all of a sudden it looks like you're looking at 16 millimeter or something. But that is to be expected, because again, this is a patchwork job. They're having to literally cobble together 5 different elements to try and make the best possible preservation master they can. And I would much rather see this done properly like this than have somebody go in and try to homogenize everything and do a DNR pass and take the grain out and play with the color and try to make everything look quote unquote appropriate for a modern display to make it pop on a 4K television. That's the last thing you want in a catalog title and doing real archival preservation. So this is akin to the other Scott MacQueen supervised restoration efforts, particularly if you've seen the amazing releases Warner Archive did of Mystery of the Wax Museum and Dr. X, the resurrections of those two-color, Technicolor, pre-code horror masterworks. This is the type of restoration work they had to do. Those had baked-in issues as well, but they were miraculous compared to what came before. That's what you get on Invaders from Mars. If you have ever seen this film before, you know just how badly it has been treated. The Laserdisc was really crummy. The DVD was just basically like a 480p version of the Laserdisc, with like maybe a few tweaks. And I think even in some spots they actually did use some still frames to try to cover up some damage, and they literally had still frames inserted in the old masters. So they were a mess, and the color was a mess, and there was a mix and match of different sources, and the quality was just all over the place, and it had this mushy look to it. It's just terrible. But that was all we could watch for years, and the DVD was out of print, so I was never able to find one. So I've just been watching the Laserdisc, and I know what a good Laserdisc transfer looks like. I know what a bad Laserdisc transfer looks like, and this is just a hodgepodge mess, to be honest. So this is a revelatory transfer. So don't go in expecting this to be absolutely pristine. But if you've ever seen this film before, as soon as the credits come up, your jaw is going to not just hit the floor, but go through the floor. This is revelatory in every regard. And what's most notable, I think, is just how much of the color nuances have been restored. It's just amazing to look at this, because you'll just find yourself wanting to just stop and marvel at how much greater the sense of visual potency is in terms of the color, the shot composition, being able to really immerse yourself in the visuals and let the power of the set design and the composition really wash over you, and then just look at the color nuances, where it's not just seemingly bursting with color, but there's additional details that I just never seen before, and they were not there on the old master. So this is just, this is astonishing. So the UHD is topped off by an HDR grading, and this is a very extremely tasteful HDR grading. This is how a catalog title should be graded. There is no revisionist HDR anywhere. This is a standard HDR10 grade. It's not HDR10 Plus. It's not Dolby Vision. It's just regular HDR10. This is another reason why the UHD is better than the Blu-ray, because you have all of that additional material to be able to better realize in the UHD realm, and with the additional benefit of being able to use HDR to allow a greater range for the light, which also gives you that greater degree of color and detail nuance. So, in my opinion, this is an example where you really do need to go for the UHD, because it really will make your experience all the more impactful. It's going to mean that obviously the inherent damage that was inescapable when that does crop up, if that sort of stuff really sticks out to you, it's going to be there regardless. But again, the Blu-ray being 1080p SDR is going to cover up a little bit of that, but again, you lose the benefit of the HDR10 allowing for the greater visual range across the board. And if any film needed a greater visual range across the board, it is Invaders from Mars, which has been treated horribly for decades until now. So this is a revelatory release in terms of the new Picture Master. This was a Herculean task to put together, so you are going to spot some anomalies. I'd say probably it's in the climax, particularly when you have the Martians running around the tunnels and things, where you're probably going to see some additional bits of noise and things. And again, they are having to patch together different elements and things. So when you're watching the UHD, a lot of the stuff is going to be much more obvious than it ever has been before, particularly because the old transfers were so bad. But the team was limited to the materials they had to work with, so do always keep that in mind. And it's important to go through all the extras and read about the restoration process so you know just how bad off the film was when they started. And do keep in mind, this is a patchwork where they are having to mix 5 different separate elements, including release prints, so elements that are many generations away from the original negative, and try to make it as cohesive as possible without altering the original negative or the original work in any way. The only thing I noticed is, again, in the sort of Martian tunnels and also on some of the stock footage of the tanks, and this may just be because they were having to use the least quality sources for some of those, and some of that Army stock footage was already stock footage, but particularly watching the UHD with the HDR10 grade, it did seem like in some of those there was a little bit of not pixelization, but there was some bit of noise and artifacting, and I mean, I don't really think it was frozen grain or anything, but you'll see that there's some noise and some stuff going on in a couple very tiny spots where, again, I think it's simply because the elements were so degraded and some of that stuff was baked in there. I don't think it's the encoding or anything, but I guess it possibly could be, but those were very, very fleeting and minor. And again, it's really only confined, at least off the top of my head, to those 2 specific moments. Now let's talk about the audio quality. The original mono track has also been restored very meticulously, just like the picture. It is presented here as lossless DTS HDMA mono, and it seems to be the same overall source as what the Laserdisc and DVD had to use. And I did a lot of comparing. So it seems like it's the same source, but what they've done, and they even talk about it in the restoration notes, which I really appreciate because very few restoration blurbs actually talk about the audio processing that had been done, because unfortunately a lot of it is way too overzealous, particularly from modern studios. But here it has been very carefully cleaned up to be as best as it possibly can be without going too crazy and trying to reduce the high end or do hiss removal and crackle removal. Now, the old releases were very hissy and had hum, plenty of ticks and pops, and they were just very, very I mean, they were listenable, like when I'm watching the Laserdisc, but it's a constant noise floor. It's constant hiss, constant ticks, constant pops, and it is very noticeable. And you do kind of have to turn it up louder to try and get past all the intensive hiss and ground hum and stuff. So that has been tamed and has been removed. But it does seem like they didn't, actually harm the integrity of the actual audio track itself. So this, I do think, is an actual better overall experience than the previous release, simply for taming the incredible amounts of hum and noise and hiss that was burying the actual dialogue and effects. You still get some high-end distortion in some of the music cues, like you did in the old track. Like it is inherent to, particularly, it's a 50s mono track of a lower budgeted film. Of course, it's going to have some harshness and distortion in the high end and the music cues especially. So that's still here. It doesn't seem like they've gone in and done anything overzealous, and I do think it is a better listen than the Laserdisc audio, for example. And I did a lot of A-Bing between the two, and that's how I was able to figure out it does seem like it's the same base source that was used on the Laserdisc, on the old master. Some people may prefer having all of the hiss and crackle left in, which I understand, and that's probably kind of where I might side more normally, but this was an example where the older track was obviously much more damaged and not in the condition it was originally. So this is a case where the cleanup was necessary. And I kind of, again, link it to Mystery of the Wax Museum and Dr. X in terms of being really intensive audio cleanup of very noisy original tracks that had been very degraded over time, and really having to sort of resurrect the audio as well as the picture. So this is an example where you should also pay attention to the audio restoration work that has been done, because it's really, really well done, and this is a title that definitely needed it. Now to talk about the packaging and overall design of the release itself. This is the 4K UHD with the new art and slipcover from Ignite Films. This again is spine number 1. The slipcover is quite nice, but you will have to be careful. A lot of people have noticed this, that the slipcover was shipped with some very adhesive stickers on top and bottom, and a lot of people, in trying to remove them, wound up tearing the slipcover. So just be careful when you remove those. I use usually for pesky stickers, I'll just use a hair dryer on low and or on cool, and that made them come off just fine. So just be careful when you remove those. And I think Ignite is helping people out with if you did have damage or slip cover, they do have some replacements you can get from them. But then the back just lists the information and the special features, and then you slip it off and you have the UHD in a typical black 4K case. The rear is the same as the slipcover. And of course, the Blu-ray will simply be the same in a Blu-ray case. Again, they are sold separately. It is not a dual format release. You open to find the disc itself with the same art and the new booklet, which I'll discuss in a sec. I think the new artwork is quite nice. It's striking, but if it were me, I prefer the original poster artwork that the Laserdisc and DVD had. That's the image I think of when I think of Invaders from Mars. But, I understand wanting this to stand apart, and, you see this and now you associate it with the new 4K UHD. So I get that. I think the art is good. I just personally myself would prefer the original poster artwork as is. And again, this was done in conjunction with Arrow Films, so when you actually pop in the disc, you'll see the traditional Arrow menu, which means a lot of people think or mistake this as an actual Arrow disc, but again, they merely just helped in the actual disc production process, so that's why it uses their menus, but it's Ignite Films and not an Arrow release. Now, the booklet is about 23 pages. It is written by Scott MacQueen. It's background on the film, lovely images, nicely laid out text, very well written because, of course, it's Scott MacQueen. But then he goes into the restoration process and also discusses the nature of the film elements and gives a description of the Cinecolor process and explaining in detail just how all this stuff worked originally and what it meant in trying to piece the film back together. He also discusses the different elements they had to use and the fact that they had to use 5 different elements. And each of them is given a full breakdown and description with pictorial examples, so you know exactly what they were working from and exactly how they had to carry out the restoration process and just how difficult it was. And the other thing is that all of this is laid out and explained in such a way that anyone can understand it. It's not talking down to you, but it's also laying it out to where a layman or someone who has never heard of a particular film format or knows anything about film stocks or film preservation or restoration or anything about film processes of the 1950s will be able to understand this and follow along and see just how difficult this was and how much hard work and blood, sweat, and tears had to go into this. That is what makes this an even better booklet essay. Not only does it go into details about every single one of the elements and the film itself, but it also does it in a way that anyone can understand it, and that it still has all the nitty-gritty details that nerds like myself want to know. So it manages to tick all the boxes and still be understandable to anyone coming across this who may know nothing about this material. And of course, got a photo of Scott MacQueen there and some final comparison photos and the premiere of this new master, and then the credits on the back. So this is one of the best booklets I've seen in a long time. It's so incredibly important, and this should be read by everyone who purchases and watches this new release. You need to then immediately read the booklet essay. And again, it's done in such a way that you'll be able to grasp and understand everything MacQueen is talking about without feeling like you're out of your element, and also for nerds like myself, you get all the nitty-gritty great details you want to know and you can sink your teeth into. So now to talk about the supplemental features, which are pretty extensive, we have the original trailer, which was scanned and restored in 4K, and that was also done to make sure they could use any shots from the trailer that they might need for the restoration. So that's technically a 6 sort of source they had to work from, because sometimes in situations like this, even the trailer can help. So that's a wonderful inclusion and amazing that we have it in 4K. That also does have the original mono of the trailer, but it's just lossy Dolby Digital. Then Ignite has made a new trailer, which has, it's a bit weird because they put a lot of effects on it and stuff, so it's kind of bizarre, but, at least they made a nice, fancy, weird, interesting new trailer, so that's included as well, also in HD. And we also have a bunch of interviews. Jimmy Hunt was interviewed and participated in this release, so he shares his recollections of shooting the film and making the film as a child actor, and then the legacy of the film and how it's come back around for him many times over the years. Then, importantly, the biographer of Menzies, James Curtis, talks about the film and its place in Menzies' career and Menzies' directing career. And of course, I'm shamelessly plugging here because his book, The Shape of Films to Come, the biography of William Cameron Menzies, is an essential film biography, as are all of Curtis's film biographies. He is one of my favorite film biographers. So if any of this interests you or you're a fan of Menzies, you need to get a copy of this and read it. It is so incredibly worth your time and such a well-written and well-researched biography. So some of the material that's in the book he does cover in the interview, so it's great having that on disc as well. And then really fascinatingly, they actually got Menzies' eldest granddaughter, Pamela Lawson, to actually share her memories and recollections of Menzies, and so you get that wonderful first-person perspective from a family member who's still with us. So that's really a nice treasure to get a greater sense of who Menzies was as a person outside of just of his legendary film career. So that's a wonderful, nice, lengthy bit of interviews. Then we get a more sort of traditional type featurette with a lot of talking heads, but just looking at the people involved. You've got John Landis, Joe Dante, Mark Goldblatt, and then Oscar winner Robert Skotak, who is credited as the foremost expert on Invaders from Mars. So the level of fandom for this film runs really deep, and a lot of people who went into the film industry. So this is one of those films that did help to spawn a lot of generations of people going into the film industry. So that's another part of its intensive legacy. And then, of course, you also have Scott MacQueen talking about the film and in this featurette. So this is the most sort of traditional making of about the film piece, and it runs a nice lengthy little chunk. So that's a wonderful inclusion. Then you have John Sayles' introduction when the film was premiered in the new master at the 2022 TCM Classic Film Festival. So that's a nice sort of you are there for all of us who couldn't afford tickets and airfare and hotel all the way out there to see the first public screening of the 4K restoration of Invaders from Mars. So that was a nice inclusion. Then we get a wonderful bit of before and after restoration clips where Scott MacQueen narrates about the various problems and specifically points things out. So you get that visual representation, and it's like you're sitting in the room with Scott MacQueen, and he's pointing on an editing monitor and saying, this is where this happened, and this was the really bad damage here, and this is where we had to mix this. So if you read the booklet essay and you want the visuals of that, this is absolutely perfect. It's about 5 to 10 minutes, and you wish it was longer because it's so well done. Then we get, really importantly, as I mentioned before, the alternate footage and alternate ending for the international version is presented here, and beautifully, it has been newly scanned. It was only scanned at 2K, but it is presented in HD from a new 2K scan. So they scanned the alternate footage that was put into the film for the international release to pad out the runtime, where obviously Jimmy Hunt is much older This hair isn't even the same, and the clothes aren't the same, and the set's a little different, and it looks really flat, and the camera is just really static, and it's just literally the dialogue scene or two, and of course the alternate ending cut that was changed and tweaked and for the international version. So all of that material is presented here in the supplements from a new 2K scan, and it looks the best I've ever seen it because it too was cleaned up and newly scanned. Then we get a pretty extensive gallery on the disc with the original pages of the press book and plenty of behind the scenes set photos and photos describing the restoration process. This is a pretty lengthy gallery, and it's always fascinating to see all the vintage advertising and promotional and press book materials. So I geek out over all that stuff. And then finally it's capped off by the 23-page booklet I already discussed, where Scott MacQueen's essay is literally titled "A Nightmare of Restoration," which is exactly what they went through to restore this film. So that title is not a joke. That is literally the best description of this. So that is another reason why the booklet's so important. The only thing I will say is I did notice one thing in the Scott MacQueen restoration featurette. It did seem like his vocal, the left track was a little louder than the right track of the audio, but that's just a minor quibble. Now, the one thing that I wish was here is I wish there was a commentary, and I wish Scott MacQueen had done it. I know that would have been the sort of cherry on top of the sundae, because Scott MacQueen, I think, is one of the best commentators in all of home video history. Every one of his commentaries is worth its weight in gold, meticulously researched, well presented, and usually with a nice bit of humor and winking at the audience. So they're always ridiculously enjoyable listens that I have re-listened to many, many times, such as his Bride of Frankenstein track, his Dr. X track, his track for both the 1925 and 1943 remake, Phantom of the Opera. So I wish he had done a commentary, but that's just wishful thinking on my part. That would be the one thing I would have loved to have had to make this even better. But you do have him in all of the featurettes and things, and you do have him talking about the restoration, and of course he wrote the essay, so that kind of makes up for it. But I still wish he had done a commentary, so that would have made this even better. I'm also surprised that there wasn't an actual critical commentary, or some of the talking heads, or maybe some of the traders from Hell People, or Joe Dante, or somebody doing a commentary. So that would be my only. The only thing I wish was here was that there was at least some kind of commentary, but the extras are really substantial. Don't get me wrong. I really love commentaries when they're well done, and for really iconic films, I kind of always hope there's a commentary track. So that was just me with wishful thinking that maybe Scott MacQueen could have done a commentary, or since I really love his other tracks, or somebody else, But that's just my own sort of minor quibble, wishful thinking. So those are my thoughts on the Ignite Films release of Invaders from Mars in this stupendous, absolutely astonishing 4K restoration supervised by Scott MacQueen. This is a dream disc. This is a disc that people have had as a pipe dream for decades. This is a film people have wanted to save and restore for decades. So I still, to this day, to this exact moment, keep expecting to wake up and find that this has all been a dream and there is no restoration of Invaders from Mars, because no one ever thought it would happen. So when it got announced, it was literally, are they actually going to be able to do this? This is going to get pulled. This is going to get canceled. There's no way. There's no way this is going to happen. And then it has, and it's here. It is worth every penny, even though it is a bit pricey. It is totally worth the $60 because, again, people have tried to restore this film for decades. It's never happened, and the old versions are so bad that, in fact, they're so bad that I think people need to actually see them who haven't, to better appreciate just how astonishing this new restoration was and how difficult it was. So do please go through all the extras and read Scott MacQueen's essay to understand the gravity of how serious these problems were, and how much blood, sweat, and tears it took to get this film to this level, which was previously thought impossible. So this is a must-own disc across the board. It is loaded with incredible extras that do total up to a nice amount of time. So, it's not just tossed off extras that are short and perfunctory. All the wonderful nitty-gritty, nerdy details are there. And all of it is presented in a way that everyone can understand it and better appreciate just how incredible a work Invaders from Mars is, and how it overcomes its low budget origins in every respect, and to better understand why this film has haunted generations for many, many reasons, but particularly terrifying children who see this film, because it is a film that is on their level. It does not speak down to children, but it gets at a lot of sort of, honestly, primordial standard fears that everyone has and everyone can understand, even as an adult. So this is a film that's only going to grow in status. It is one of the iconic classic landmark 50s science fiction films. It belongs in the canon list with Invasion of the Body Snatchers and Forbidden Planet. It really is right there with them, even in spite of its low budget. And all of this due to the incredible artistry of William Cameron Menzies, who was a genius in so many different ways. And again, the more you read up on his history and his career, which I highly encourage people to read, the James Curtis biography of Menzies, the more you read on Menzies, the more you quickly realize that people just didn't understand at the time how much he was, decades ahead of everyone else. And now people take so many things for granted that he actually pioneered. So this is an incredible cinematic experience, and one that I think everyone should see. And now they can see the film properly and experience it properly in this breathtaking new 4K restoration here on disc from Ignite Films. One of the finest releases of 2022, without question. A disc I thought never would happen. A restoration none of us thought would ever happen. A restoration that's been a pipe dream for many fans for decades is finally here, and just absolutely astonishing. So don't be put off by the slightly higher asking price. Yeah, I know it's a little pricey, but this is one of those special cases where none of us thought this would ever happen, and the work that has been put in really is worth your support. So please do go and purchase a copy of this, enjoy it, and support. So do please go to Ignite Films and purchase a copy of this release, enjoy it, and look at all the extras and read the booklet to understand just how much hard work went into this release, and also show your support for this level of intensive film restoration and preservation, and your support of Ignite Films, who is going to continue doing releases like this of titles that have yet to be announced. So, as always, I hope this has been at least somewhat fun and informative to hear my babblings about classic films and physical media releases and home video transfers. I really do want to strongly encourage people to pick up this release. It is really that important and that astounding. This is a disc no one ever thought was going to happen, particularly at this point. So, again, I keep expecting to wake up and find it's all been a dream. So, as always, do keep supporting both boutique and studio labels by buying films on disc to help keep physical media and film culture alive. And thank you ever so much for watching. And no, I don't have a mark on the back of my neck, see? No mark! No mark!